Down-to-Earth Wisdom, Part 6, Marriage, the Union of Two Learners. One of the most important decisions we make in life is who will be our husband or wife. But what is the secret to a happy marriage?
I think what makes a happy, long marriage is to have honesty with the two people who are in the relationship.
Strong character, commitment, a clear understanding going into the marriage, what marriage is about.
Good lasting marriage has the other part of the relationship in mind. If I were to get married, I should be thinking of my husband's needs and desires all the time, and he should be doing the same for me.
Things that make a good, healthy, lasting marriage. There has to be a connection, a communication. But yes, not just on emotional levels. I mean, there has to be a spiritual connection as well.
I think God in a marriage makes a difference, especially if you have children.
I know a lot of people who are in strong, healthy, loving, long-term committed relationships who, for one reason or another, have decided not to get married.
I think couples should be getting married if it's right for the couple. It depends on certain people and what their choices are.
Values and priorities should be the same, though. Those are a lot harder to iron out as the marriage goes on.
Another important thing would be that our relationship is God-centered and that we're both driven towards the same goal in our marriage.
On today's program, Charles Price gives us the biblical recipe for the most intimate of all relationships.
The book of Proverbs, chapter 31. Proverbs chapter 31, I'm going to read from verse 10 down to the end of the chapter. And this is headed in my Bible, The Wife of Noble Character. I want to read this description to you. The wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships, bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hand she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. I imagine that's to make them conspicuous in the snow. She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed with fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gates when he takes his seat among the elders of the land. Well, she's no time to take a seat anywhere by the sound of it, but that's what he does for a living. He takes his seat. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. I think that's an understatement. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the reward she has earned, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. Wow. That is some lady. And I'm intrigued that the first verse of that chapter says, these are the sayings of King Lemuel, an oracle his mother taught him. So she was obviously very ambitious for her son, teaching him the kind of wife that he should have. Now, this is the 6th week in which we've been looking into the book of Proverbs, and we're looking under the title, Down-to-Earth Wisdom. And one area where wisdom is expressed most strongly is in the area of relationships. Because the richness of a person's life is not found in their material possessions, and their assets, the richness of a person's life is found in the quality of their relationships. And if the most satisfying thing about us is our relationships, the most intimate and the most important relationship into which we may come is the relationship of marriage. And I'm calling my talk this morning, Marriage, the Union of Two Learners. Two growers, if you like. You see, the two most important decisions you make in life are these. Number one, who is going to be my master? That's the most important question that you have to answer in life. And don't say you're not mastered, because you are. The book of Romans tells us in chapter 6, verse 16, don't you know, when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you're slaves to the one whom you obey. Whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. He says you've basically got two choices, sin or righteousness. And everything you do in life will be an expression of what is mastering your life. That's why that's the most important decision you ever make. The second most important decision is this. If the first is who is my master, the second is who is my mate. You see, life consists of many relationships. Some are casual relationships, some friendships, work colleagues, neighbors, but some are close relationships, especially within the family, the relationship with our parents, with our children, and with our spouse, our husband or our wife. Now, you don't choose your parents. You have no say in that. You don't actually choose your children. You may decide when you want to have children, but you don't choose who they are, their personality, their temperament, their character, the kind of person they're going to become in the course of time. But you do choose your wife. If you have a difficult marriage, it's nobody else's fault, by the way, but yours. You choose with all that you are to marry this woman with all that she is, or this man with all that he is. And the closest relationship, the most intimate relationship to which any of us can ever be part of, is the relationship of marriage. Now, Solomon, who is responsible for much of the book of Proverbs, knew a lot about marriage. In fact, if you read in 1 Kings chapter 11 sometime, I won't read it to you now, you'll discover there that Solomon married 700 wives. It then tells us they were daughters of the kings of Egypt, daughters of the kings of the Moabites, daughters of the kings of the Ammonites, daughters of the kings of Syria, etc. Because in those days, you didn't build relationships with other countries by having ambassadors come and sit in the court in Jerusalem. You had a better way. You married into the families. And so your in-laws were the local, or brother-in-laws in the course of time, or sisters-in-law would be the local leaders in the surrounding nations. Now, I can't figure out how Solomon managed to get 700, even so. But that was part of the culture. But in addition to his 700 wives, it says he had 300 concubines. That is, women on the side. I don't know whether you get to know them all or what happened. The mind boggles at the prospect. Suffice it to say this, Solomon was a connoisseur of marriage. And it was his marriages that messed him up. Because we're told in verse 4 of 1 Kings chapter 11, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not right with the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. It messed Solomon's life up. But despite Solomon's polygamous life, I'll tell you something that's very important to observe, that all the teaching in Proverbs is about one man married to one woman for life. And that is consistent with the whole of teaching on marriage right through the scriptures. One man, one woman, as long as both are living. Now let me talk about three things regarding marriage. First of all, marriage has to be found. Now I'll tell you why I say that. Marriage has to be found. Because in Proverbs 18 and verse 22, it says, he who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord. You've got to find a wife or a husband. Proverbs is written from a male perspective, so it talks about finding a wife rather than a husband, but you've got to find a wife. Now, most of us are interested in marriage. When we come into adulthood, most of us want to marry, most of us expect to marry, and most of us don't relish the idea that we may not marry. And I'll tell you why. That is your expectancy. When God created in the beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, it says God expressed his verdict on everything he created, and he looked at it and said it was good. In fact, it says God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. But before the fall took place, in Genesis chapter 3, before sin entered the world, there was one thing God said was not good. And you find in Genesis 2 verse 18, it is not good for man to be alone. And the fact that it's not good for man to be alone is part of what God said was good. It's good that it's not good for man to be alone. Does that make sense? You see, God created, as part of perfection, he created man as a social being. That is, we're not insular. He engineered our need for friendship, for fellowship, for companionship. In fact, it is a weakness to be self-sufficient. And if you say, I don't need anybody in my life, you've got a problem. Because you're not created that way. You're created to be not good to be alone. He made us a social being. Secondly, he made us a sexual being. And sexuality is not a consequence of the fall. It's part of the perfection that God created that said it's good, it's good. Now we must learn to keep it in perspective. And we talked about that a little last week. But our social needs and our sexual needs all contribute to the desire for marriage. But having said that, we have to be realistic. Not everybody is going to marry. Jesus talked about this on one occasion in Matthew chapter 19, and he gave 3 reasons why not everybody will marry. Let me read you what he said. He said, some are eunuchs. Now, eunuch is literally a castrated male, and there were such in that day. Though in the context, Jesus is speaking of those who remain unmarried. And he says, some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men. Others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who should accept this, the one who can accept this, should accept it. Now, there are 3 things he says there. First, there's some who are born that way. Now, I can only speculate as to what Jesus meant exactly, but the implication is that they lack the desire or even the need, perhaps, to marry. Maybe they have a low sex drive. Maybe they're very self-sufficient people in some way. Maybe they're folks whose energies get channeled into some goal and purpose and function in life, and that is all consuming to them, and they find satisfaction in the channeling of their energies in such a way. So some are born that way, and they're not particularly concerned about wanting to marry. There's some who are made that way by men, said Jesus. He probably is referring to the physical act of making a person a eunuch by castration, which did take place. But I think we'd recognize, too, that there's some of them made that way by men emotionally. That is, they have suffered abuse, they have been scarred, they have been damaged. And one of the consequences of that has been the inability to sustain relationships well. Now, there's hope for people who are in that situation, but there are people who find themselves where it's difficult to build good, wholesome relationships for whatever reason. They've been made that way by men. Third reason, said Jesus, is some have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. That is, they've sensed that God has called them into some sphere in life where they can best fulfill that function by renouncing marriage and living as a single person. I know some people who have done that. I know a man who was a great influence on me from my late teens. And one day I was sitting talking to him. He was in his mid-60s at this stage. He said to me, when I was 18, in my daily quiet time with God, I was reading Matthew 19 when Jesus said, some have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. And as I read it, I knew God was speaking to me and saying, that is what I want for you. I had not known that about him, and I said, has that been easy for you? He said, in one sense, yes, in another sense, no. Yes, in the sense, from the age of 18 on, I never tried to develop a relationship with a girl that might lead to romance and marriage. I accepted it. So I never allowed myself to get into a relationship with a girl. And in that sense, because I accepted it, it's been straightforward. But he said it's also been difficult, especially, he says, as I've got into my older years, I sometimes just long for that friendship. I long for that union with somebody else that I've not had through my life. And I always respected this man, but my respect went up leaps and bounds because that was costly to him, both for the sake of the kingdom. And there are those that God has called to that. We're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, Paul speaks about celibacy as being a gift. The gift of celibacy. Now, most of us don't think of that as being a gift. It's sort of a fate that you want to avoid, possibly. But I think what Paul means there is that if God calls you to a single life, or you find yourself in a single life, he will give you the gift of celibacy, meaning the gift of the ability to live a fulfilled life as a single person. And we need to thank God for those who have accepted that from God. Let me tell you, the mission fields, or many of the mission fields of the world, will collapse if single missionaries were withdrawn from the field, especially single ladies. I've been to many mission fields. I've been to spoken to many mission conferences on the field where there are many single folks who've gone in obedience to God to serve him in ways that would not have been appropriate with a family. But if those are three reasons Jesus gave, I want to give you a fourth reason. And it's simply a question of arithmetic. The fourth reason is there's not enough of the opposite sex to go round. Let me explain. There are slightly more males born than females every year. Now, you may know that women live an average of 7 years longer than men. And so actually, any given time, the balance of male and female alive in the world is just about equal, remarkably. But there are more males born than females, which means if every female were to marry a man, there'd be some men left over who would not marry simply because there's not enough to go around. Now, if that's the statistic in the world at large, when you become a Christian and join the Church of Jesus Christ, you discover that statistic reverses. There are more Christian women than there are Christian men. And if we're going to marry in obedience to God, we're going to marry somebody who is a Christian. We're told, do not yoke yourselves, a believer, with an unbeliever. Do not, as a Christian, marry an unchristian. And that means that if every Christian man marries, there'll be Christian women who won't marry, not because they were born that way, not because they've been made that way by men, not because God has called them specifically to a vocation that involves a single life, but simply there aren't enough men to go round. In Sweden, the ratio of female Christian to male Christian is about 2 to 1. I remember once speaking at a youth event, and I was talking to a girl of 18 afterwards, and she said to me a question I've never been asked, and I've led somebody to Christ before, and the question was this: will I be able to marry? And I said, why do you ask that question? She said, because there are so many unmarried girls and women in our church. And I said, you know, if you give your life to Christ and you allow him to reign in your life, what you will do is reduce your marriage possibility by about 50%. Simply because there aren't enough Christian men in Sweden to go around. And she accepted that and gave her life to Christ. Now, some of you guys here don't get the next plane to Sweden. But it's an issue. If we're honest, of course, there are disadvantages in being single. If we're honest, also, there are advantages in being single. When I met Hillary, I think I was 28 or I was 27. I was trying to work it out last night, and I'm not sure. She would know, but I'm not sure. I had already spent 4 years or so as a single man in ministry. I was traveling, preaching, teaching, different place every week, just about, all over Britain and then Europe and North America. And I want to be honest with you and tell you, I got tired as I traveled in that single state of meeting people who would ask me, when are you going to settle down? As though the only sensible option was to find a wife and marry her. If I was to remain single, which was not what I hoped would be the case, but is always a possibility, I didn't need people getting on my back saying, this is not the best thing, this is not good, you better change and settle down and find a wife. Because I want to say to you that the Church of Jesus Christ ought to affirm single people, needs to affirm their status, needs to support them. And if I can say it honestly, get off their backs if you're trying to get them all fixed up. Because that's what I felt people try to do with me. But the vast majority will marry. Now, I used to say to the college-age students I used to work with many years, I'd say to them, don't rush into marriage. Get your bearings in life, find out where you're going, because the Song of Songs tells us 3 times. And Song of Songs, of course, is another book of Solomon's, and it's about romance and love, and he says there 3 times, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Don't wake it up until you're ready. And don't be in a hurry, because all your contemporaries have got girlfriends or boyfriends, and you're already 21 years of age, and they're going to be on the shelf. Don't worry. Just wait. And in the right time, you see, God will give you. Because in Proverbs 19, verse 14, it says, houses and riches are an inheritance from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. And so you wait his timing, whatever it is. And it's better to want what you don't have than to end up having what you don't want. Does that make sense? It's better to want what you don't have than end up having what you don't want because you didn't wait. So marriage has to be found, first of all. That's the first point. Secondly, marriage has to be formed. You see, good marriages don't just happen. The fact that some of us may be having a difficult marriage, and let's be honest, probably a number of us in this building this morning are having a difficult marriage, it does not mean you married the wrong person. It just means you've got to work on making that marriage good and well. You see, marriage is going to be tough work. It's the blending of 2 people. It's the blending of 2 lives. I didn't know how selfish I was until I married. I'd been living independently. I'd left home when I was 18. I'd never lived again at home. And I've been fairly independent for some years. I've been on the move and traveling around, as I say, preaching, teaching. The day we got engaged, I gave my wife a ring, gave her a kiss, and I got on the plane. I flew across to North America for 6 weeks in 6 different locations, and I flew back to London, changed planes the same day, flew on to Germany for 2 weeks, went down to Austria for a week of ministry, got back home, went somewhere else. In the year of our engagement, I saw Hillary about 6 times altogether. That was my fault, not hers. And so when we got married, I mean, this was lifestyle. I basically said, you know, pack your bags, let's go. And during our engagement year, I'd planned to be home for her birthday, which I was. The next day, I went off to Mississippi. We were together for Christmas. Next day, I went to India, and I spent some weeks traveling through India at different conferences and evangelistic events and so on. So when we got married, this was lifestyle. Pack your bags. The first 9 months of our marriage, we spent 3 days in England, and that was changing planes 3 times. We were in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and I gave her a hard year. And no wonder, because I discovered I'd been so self-centered. I'd seen Hillary as an extension of myself. Listen, never make that mistake. Your wife is not an extension of you. She's her own person. That's one of the great things about coming to Toronto, because for 20 years, Hillary will tell you I was away 8 or 9 months every year. That's not true. That's an exaggeration. I was away 5 or 6 at most. But now we're here. Of course, I'm home the whole time, which is fun, but we don't know what to talk about because we've said it all. She's away this weekend speaking at a conference of ladies, and she told me about 6 months ago, I think I'm going to limit my weekend engagements to 2 a month. So you're getting your own back, aren't you? That's really what it's about. But expectations in marriage can be very different. Some expectations are unreasonable. I heard about a marriage counselor who asked a couple, when did you first started having disagreements? And the wife said, well, it all began on our wedding day when he wanted to be in the wedding photos. I think that's a little unreasonable. But some are reasonable. Somehow we've never really stopped to think, what makes a marriage work? What makes two people blend together, not to become clones of each other, two individuals, but working, living, functioning well in harmony together like cogs that interconnect properly? I want to suggest 5 things very quickly. And as I said, I prepared too much for this morning, so I'll run through these fairly quickly. And you can think about them, take them home with you and discuss them with each other to see if some of these may help you. The first thing needed in marriage is what I've called consecration. By that I mean that we are set apart to God, the centrality of God in our lives. Proverbs 19:23 says, the fear of the Lord leads to life. And if the fear of the Lord leads to life, it goes without saying that the fear of the Lord should be the foundation of a good, wholesome, growing marriage in both of our lives individually, and then together, in union together. 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. What do righteousness and wickedness have in common? What fellowship can light have with darkness? Now he's talking about marriage there. He says, you're going to be yoked together. Don't be yoked with an unbeliever. You see, yoking was something you did with oxen. When I farmed for a couple of years in Africa, we used oxen. And when you yoke 2 oxen together, one may be stronger than the other, so you adjust the yoke so they both pull equal sense of weight and pressure. And you yoke them together. You learn to live in harmony together. When you yoke together, you're going in the same direction. You're heading for the same goal. Now said Paul, do not be yoked with an unbeliever. You're not sharing the same goals in life. You do not have the same fundamental values in life. How can you if one knows Christ and the other doesn't? Now when you marry and after marriage one of you comes to Christ, it's a wonderful thing you come to Christ. And your prayer will be that your partner, your husband, your wife will also come to Christ. That maybe in the meantime, some of you in that situation, he or she hasn't yet come to Christ. And God is going to be at work with you in that situation. And he'll bless you and enrich you in that situation. But if you choose to marry somebody who's not a believer when you are, it is actually disobedience. And you're building a foundation that does not begin with the will of God. And I encourage you, if you're not married, to make that decision before God. You'll only marry somebody who knows God and loves God and whose life is surrendered to the Lordship of Christ. So the first ingredient is consecration. And by the way, that you grow spiritually together as well in marriage. The second key ingredient is character. You see, you will marry a fallen person, and you yourself are a fallen person, but it's necessary in the relationship that you develop that ability to trust. Trust is crucial in a marriage relationship. Once trust has been undermined, it's very hard to rebuild. You can with time, but it's very hard to rebuild. And if your wife or husband has had reason to distrust you, it's not enough to say, well, I've said I'm sorry. Isn't that enough? No, it's not. You need to take time to rebuild the trust. You see, Proverbs 11 verse 3 says, the integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed for their duplicity. The integrity of the upright guides them. And the upright person is a person of integrity, and you need to be able to trust each other as people of integrity. Proverbs 12 verse 4 says, a wife of noble character is her husband's crown, but a disgraceful wife is like decay in his bones. A noble character is someone who is utterly trustworthy in your relationship. So character is the second ingredient. The third ingredient is communication. Probably the single most common complaint about marriage is poor communication. Especially it is the complaint of the wife towards the husband. He doesn't communicate. Well, that's because men and women communicate differently, and they communicate for different reasons, and we need to understand that. You see, I don't want to generalize. Well, I will. I don't like to generalize, but I will. It is well known that women talk more than men. But there is a reason for that. For a woman, talking has a purpose. It is to build the relationship. It's to make friends. It's to share something of yourself. It's to learn something of the person's self. It's building relationships. That's why a woman talks. For a man, talking has a purpose as well. The purpose is to fix problems. When the problem is fixed, nothing more to talk about. Not talking is perfectly normal for a lot of men. It's like Tarzan and Jane. You know, when Tarzan and Jane meet, he's up there on the bow and Jane's down here. And she says, oh, at last I found him, Tarzan, the man of my dreams. There he is, the gorgeous brute. He's coming into my life. He's going to make me his woman. He'll make me live happily ever after. And Tarzan comes swinging in, lands and says, me Tarzan, you Jane. End of conversation. I've said it. That's all you need to know. I'm Tarzan, you're Jane. Aye. I have a book here. It's called Why Men Can Only Do One Thing at a Time and Women Never Stop Talking. It's actually given my wife by my mother-in-law in the hope, I think, that I would read it, but I'm going to read part of it to you. Barbara and Alan were getting ready to go to a party. Barbara had bought a new dress and wanted to look her best. She held up 2 pairs of shoes, one blue, one gold, and then she asked Alan the question that all men fear. Darling, which should I wear with this dress? A cold chill ran down Alan's back. He knew he was in trouble. Whichever you like, sweetheart, he stammered. Come on, Alan, she said impatiently. Which looks better, blue or gold? Gold, he replied nervously. So what's wrong with the blue, she said. You never liked them. I paid a fortune for them, and you hate them, don't you? Alan's shoulders slumped. If you don't want my opinion, Barbara, don't ask, he said. You see, he thought he'd been asked to fix the problem. And when he solved it, she wasn't at all grateful. Barbara, however, was using a typical female speech trait. It's called indirect speech. She'd already decided which shoes she was going to wear and didn't want another opinion. She just wanted confirmation that she looked good. If a woman asks blue or gold when selecting shoes, it's important that a man does not give an answer. Instead, he should ask, have you chosen a pair, darling? Most women are taken aback by this approach because most men, they know, immediately state a preference. Well, I thought I could possibly wear the gold, she'll say uncertainly. The reality is she's already chosen the gold shoes. Why the gold, he'll ask. Well, because I'm wearing gold accessories and my dress has a gold pattern in it, she'll respond. A skilled man would then reply, great choice. You look fabulous. You've done well. I love it. Is any wonder communication is a problem? We're from different planets. It feels like that sometimes. We ask questions for different reasons. Understand. It took me a while to understand when my wife talks to me about an issue, she doesn't want a solution. She wants to talk about it. And when I give a solution, it's not the right one anyway. So communication. See, Proverbs 20 verse 5 says the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters, but a man of understanding draws them out. That's talking about friendship there, but it applies to marriage. There are deep waters down there in the heart of your wife, in the heart of your husband, and understanding draws them out. It's part of the adventure of living together. Now listen, when good communication is absent, you can be sure that poor communication will reign. Quite a few verses in Proverbs about nagging, quarrelsome women. I'll read them to you, then ask you an important question. Chapter 19, verse 13 says, a quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping. It's actually a torture dripping. Chapter 21, verse 9 says, it's better to live on the corner of a roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. I'm sure Solomon built flat roofs on his palaces. Chapter 21, verse 19 says it's better to live in a desert than with a quarrelsome and ill-tempered wife. Chapter 27, verse 15 says a quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. Restraining her is like restraining the wind or grasping oil with the hand. Well, these are not very flattering statements about this quarrelsome wife, and she must take responsibility for her behavior. But here's the question I want to ask. Why is she behaving this way? Maybe, husbands, it's the only way she can express herself, because you've closed down every good way by not listening and talking. You see, it could be the relationship is disintegrating and proper communication is being frustrated. And so when she does communicate, it becomes nag, 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 quarrel, 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 drip, 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 drip. May be good if that's your problem to stop and listen once in a while and understand. Maybe there's something going on that needs to come out. You need to know. Because you see, a person who is habitually quarrelsome is so, not because that's what they think makes a good life, but that's because they're frustrated in some way. The fourth C is commitment. When I mean commitment, I don't just mean commitment to the marriage, but I mean commitment to growing together, commitment to supporting each other, commitment to understanding each other, commitment to enriching each other, commitment to loving each other. And your commitment is not to changing each other. Because you are who you are. She is who she is. He is who he is. I heard about a nervous bride on one occasion who, as she approached her wedding day, was afraid she would get it wrong and wouldn't do the right thing and go to the right place in the service. And the minister said, no, I want to give you, set your mind at ease. It's going to be very straightforward. When you arrive at the church, you just walk up the aisle, and then you stop at the altar, and then the minister will announce the hymn, and then everything will follow naturally after that. So just make sure you've got those three things, that you walk up the aisle, you stop at the altar, and you sing the first hymn, and just relax. And anything you have to do, you'll be asked to do. I'll ask you questions, and everything will be okay. So that was fine. And when she arrived for the service, as she got to the car, as she walked towards the church door, she was heard to be saying, she had this steely look in her eye, and she was heard to be saying, I'll alter him. I'll alter him. I'll alter him. But let me tell you, you won't alter him. You won't. Don't marry somebody you want to change. Marry somebody you're willing to love. You will change. You'll grow. But that's why it's so important to get to know the person you're going to marry before marriage. So there's no big surprises. There will be some surprises afterwards. There will be the rest of your life. Men. I only know about that side of the equation. You'll get lots of surprises. Hopefully most of them are good. But get note, when I worked with students, I used to say to them, most of them at the sort of marriageable age or ready to marry, I'd say to them, make sure you get to know the person well. In our Bible school, I'd say to our students, if you form a friendship here, don't make any promises while you're here. You don't know the person here. You're in an unreal situation. Wait until you get home and you've been home and you've met them. We had students from all around the world, and they might say, well, I live in Japan and he lives in Chile. It's a long way apart, you know. We've got to make some kind of commitment. No, don't. Just save up the airfare. It's cheaper in the long run than making commitment prematurely. And lots listened to me, but some didn't. And I'm sorry to tell you that some who didn't had marriages that only lasted 2-3 years. Because they really didn't know each other. And it's important you get to know each other, especially when there's cross-cultural involved, as was at Cape Murray, because students came from all around the world. But take time, get to know each other, because then you're committed, and your commitment is for life. And the fifth thing is chemistry. Consecration, character, communication, commitment, chemistry. The physical chemistry is important. Now, to marry on the grounds of physical attraction alone is a recipe for disaster. Those who monitor these things tell us that marriage is based on physical attraction lasts between 6 months and 2.5 years. And if you doubt that, just look at Hollywood, which is made up of beautiful people. And marriages don't usually last very long. The point is, you will be physically attracted to your partner because you love the person who lives in that body. And because you love the person, you love their body too. But be warned, bodies get older, including yours, as well as hers or his. And Proverbs encourages the physical, sexual enjoyment in marriage. Proverbs 5 verse 18, may your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breasts satisfy you always, may you ever be captivated by her love. That's pretty explicit. He's saying, hey, listen, enjoy your wife, enjoy the sexual side of marriage, enjoy the chemistry that brings you together in that way. But every good thing needs working on. Good marriages don't just happen. Marriages are a result of a lot of thought, discipline, time, consideration, unselfishness, forgiveness, love. When I was thinking about this, and I've been married for 23 years, that's one way to measure it. Another way is to say I've been married for 3 children. Sleepless nights, changing diapers, 1 heart attack, 1 ectopic pregnancy, 1 or 2 periods of depression. I mean, this is what marriage is about. Things that are tough, things that are difficult sometimes. But you work together. And when she's in need, you're her rock. When you're in need, she's your rock. If you're both in need, well, that happens too. Learn to strengthen each other. See, Proverbs 15 verse 17 says, better is a meal of vegetables where there is love than a fattened calf with hatred. Listen, your relationships are much more important than your material comforts and assets. Much more important. That's where they have their priority. And it's better to have just a meal of vegetables where there's love and have all the food in the world and there's hatred. Proverbs 17 verse 1, better a dry crust and peace and quiet than a house with feasting and strife. But let me very quickly, I've got a third point which I haven't time to go into with you except for one thing. The heading was marriage has to be fed. Has to be found, has to be formed, has to be fed. So once you find your marriage partner, you've got to form your marriage. You've got to feed each other in some way. Let me read you one verse. Proverbs chapter 30 verse 21. Under 3 things the earth trembles. That's interesting. What kind of things do you think the earth trembles under? A servant who becomes a king, a fool who is full of food, and an unloved woman who is married. Why is that one of the things under which the earth trembles? An unloved woman who is married. Because a married woman has the right to be loved. That was the commitment her husband made to her on their wedding day. You know, you're not asked to say on your wedding day, I do. It's actually the in-laws who give away the bride who say, I do. but the husband and wife say, I will. The question they're asked is this: will you take this woman or this man as your wife or your husband to live together in marriage according to God's laws? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and keep her in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, keep only unto her as long as you both shall live? And you answer, I will. And that means if your lady decides, I don't love her anymore, that's irrelevant. You made a commitment. You said, I will. If you don't love her a year later because you made the wrong choice, you've got to live with your wrong choice. I'd like to tell you how marriage is fed, but you won't have any lunch if I do. Except there's got to be mutual respect, mutual trust, mutual love. These are the three essential ingredients, I think, in marriage. Respect, trust, love. Keep your respect. Respect one another. Trust one another. And out of that, by the way, the love will flow. Once respect has been undermined, once trust has been undermined, love becomes undermined. So you respect one another, trust one another, and love one another. And the greatest asset a man could ever have is a wife of noble character who fears the Lord, which Proverbs talks about. And the greatest asset a woman could ever have is a husband of noble character who fears the Lord. I want to ask you, does your wife have that kind of husband? And ask you men, you women, does your husband have that kind of wife? And to those of you who are single, if you have to wait longer for her or for him than you would have liked to have done, just hang in there. It'll be worth it eventually. I know.